Alduin, destroyer, devourer, master. His dark wings beat like dread omens, emerging from the choking smoke of a burning horizon. Kine, the hawk, wife of Shor, had the gifts of fore and hindsight. She gazed upon that distant conflagration, across a haze of time and space, to the scorched remnants of that other world. The heavens opened above her, and she wept. Her tears nurtured the verdure, and filled the air with the sweet earthy scent of life and loam. She saw through blurred vision the World Eater's approach, and her whimpers turned to wails at the thought of all that destruction. Her grief-stricken lament was a wind that took up the seeds of new life, and spread them across the fertile ground. Oh, such sickly sweet irony, that her sorrow cultivated the land that the impending Doom Dragon would soon devour. The brilliant Black Dragon's coming is as inevitable as it is impartial. Soaring above the tides of fate, all who see Alduin know that he is but a servant of prophecy. Varieties of Faith says, Alduin is the Nordic variation of Akatosh, and only superficially resembles his counterpart in the Nine Divines. Alduin's sobriquet, the World Eater, comes from the myths that depict him as the horrible, ravaging firestorm that destroyed the last world to begin this one. Nords therefore see the god of time as both creator and harbinger of the apocalypse. He is not the chief of the Nordic pantheon, but its wellspring, albeit a grim and frightening one. Birth and death, with the concept of time in play, one must lead to the other. When one dies of old age, should they rue the hourglass? Alduin is an unstoppable force of nature, made material to carry out the Time Dragon's will in the mortal realm. But the self-proclaimed firstborn son of Akatosh seemingly defied his destiny and was instead consumed by avarice. In the words of his beloved brother Parthenax, Alduin had flown far from the path of right action in his Parlock, the arrogance of his power. But I've been studying the Black Herald of Tamriel's termination, and I have an alternate hypothesis. What if, by becoming a tyrant, Alduin was fulfilling his purpose as the World Eater after all? What if domination and cruel oppression are fundamental facets of his nature? I believe it was the children of the sky, in service to the almighty Shor, who went off script when they sent him forward in time. And I believe Shor's victory over Auriel, in vengeance for his loss in the Dawn War, was secured by none other than you, the Dovahkiin. But before we discuss the Dragon War and the purpose of the World Eater, we must delve into his true identity. Whether or not Alduin is in actuality the son of Akatosh is up for debate. Is it really possible to prove it? In a way, all dragons are gods because they're immortal entities, and Alduin proved himself to be the mightiest of the dragons. So it would be fair to call him the preeminent son of the time dragon Akatosh. It's also important to identify the distinction between the Alduin of the Nordic pantheon and the eponymous black dragon who subjugated the Northmen. They essentially fulfill the same purpose, but the former is mythic and the latter is manifest. The way I see it, just like Shor Shazar Lorcan has his Shezarene avatars on Tamriel, carrying out his divine will, Alduin Auriel has his equivalent. We'll discuss the complicated case of Akatosh later, but the Nordic variant Alduin and the Elven variant Auriel share a lot of similarities. The only real difference between the two is how they're perceived. They have the same ambitions, only men see those motives as malevolent, while elves see them as sacrosanct. Auriel famously saw the mortal realm of Mundus as a trap, and he pleaded with Anu, imploring the primordial spirit to take them back. But the ineffable light had already filled their places with something else. But Anu's soul was gentler, and granted Auriel his bow and shield, so that he might save the Aldmer from the hordes of men. Auriel went to war with Lorcan and his mannish masses, an ancient conflict, doomed to repeat itself at the beginning end of every Kalpa. This Dawn War would always end the same, as stated by the monomyth. Finally, Trinomac, Auriel's greatest knight, knocked Lorcan down in front of his army, and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorcan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auriel for all time. But when Trinimac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other." So Auriel fastened the thing to an arrow and let it fly long into the sea, where no aspect of the new world may ever find it. Simply put, Auriel eternally endeavours to put an end to Lorkhan's treacherous trap, the mortal realm. And while Lorkhan always loses the war, he cannot be killed. Alduin of the Nordic pantheon is no different to Auriel. He is barbarous and cruel, rather than a noble liberator, but his purpose is the same, to destroy Lorkhan or Shor's creation. The text titled The Alduin Akatosh Dichotomy draws a connection between this Dawn War and the Dragon War of the early First Era. Other stories revolve around Alduin acting as some sort of dragon king, uniting the other dragons in a war against mankind, until he was eventually defeated at the hands of one or more brave heroes. Auriel led the elves against Shor and his legions of men, while Alduin led the dragons against the Nords. The Khajiit of elsewhere call Alduin Alkhan, and the writings of the silent priest Amon-Dro include a reference to this quintessential conflict. The songs tell us Alkhan was slain by Lorkhaj and his companions, but as an immortal son of Akka, he will return from the many paths in time. He is the enemy of Alkosh, Kanafi, and Lorkhaj, and ever hungers for his crown. We'll talk more about the Dragon War soon, but it seems as though the Nordic Alduin is the war form of the elven Auriel. Additionally, you may notice that the cats call Alkhan the enemy of Alkosh, placing their equivalent to Akatosh on the same side as Kanafi and Lorkhaj, aka Kine and Shor. This is why we can't invoke the name Akatosh in this discussion. If you saw my video on the monkey monk, the prophet Maruk, you may recall that, in founding the Cyrodiilic Empire, Saint Alicia merged elements of human and elven belief to create something more palatable to a cosmopolitan, diverse society. Akatosh, therefore, was a coalescence of the elven Auriel and the Nordic Shor. With this additional context, I'm sure you can see why that is a volatile deific concoction. These gods are at odds, and it's no wonder that Akatosh was driven mad by the contradiction. Akatosh of the Divines is a dichotomy. He is a combination of Shor, who wishes to see the mortal realm endure eternally, for it is his creation, and Auriel Alduin, who wishes to end the world and return to Etherius. If Akatosh was but another name for Auriel Alduin, then why would he materialize as a golden dragon to thwart the efforts of Dagon, when he tried to destroy Tamriel during the Oblivion Crisis? I believe that was the human side of the god, carrying out his will through Martin the Martyr. To the Nords, Shor is the dead chief of their pantheon, and Kine is his widow. According to the catfolk, Kine is a spirit of mourning, as it is written that when Lorkhaj died, she hid herself in a storm and wept until Alkosh came to comfort her. Once again, why would Akatosh comfort Shor's wife? If he were just another form of Auriel Alduin, then she would be his enemy. But Shor exists within Akatosh. The silent priest also says, "The children of Akka overthrew Alkosh and scattered his body on the west wind." It is said that when Kanafi learned this, she flew across the many paths and put Alkosh back together. The children of Akka could be Auriel's elves, or Alduin's dragons, for their purposes are interchangeable. Alicia assembled Akatosh from elements of Auriel and Shor. Perhaps in Khajiiti folklore, it was Kanafi who put Alkosh back together with elements of her beloved dead Lorkhaj. The gods of the Elder Scrolls are incredibly complex, especially because we have to take into account the many cultures and their perceptions of the same deities. But I think we now have all the fundamental knowledge needed to truly understand the roles of Auriel, Alduin, and Akatosh. Auriel wishes to see the mortal realm unmade, so that the spirits trapped within can return to Etherius. Alduin wishes to devour the world, whether literally or metaphorically, and this aligns with the motives of his elven counterpart. But as we all know, when Alduin manifests on Nirn, he does not devour, he dominates. The question is why? Was Alduin fulfilling his intended purpose? Or was he corrupted by a megalomaniacal desire to rule the world he swore to destroy? Unlike men, mer and beasts, the nature and origins of the dragons is not so well documented. There are plenty of creation myths for the birth of the mortal races, their gradual decline from greater to lesser spirits when subjected to the limiting effects of Lorkhan's mortal realm. But the dragons are immortal, and we can't even be sure whether they initially appeared in northern Atmora or the Dragonland of Akavir. What we do know, however, as stated by the prolific mage Shalador in his Insights, is that in the beginning, dragons were wild and uncivilized, like everything else. Alduin the Firstborn was the one responsible for teaching the dragons to form civilizations. If this is true, then Alduin seemingly went against his fundamental purpose, for civilizations are built to endure, not to bring about the apocalypse. The most noteworthy text on the Dragon War, written by the Nordic scholar Torhall Bjork, asserts that the Nordic settlers in Skyrim brought their animal totem gods with them from Atmora. Among these totems was of course the dragon. Alternatively, the etched tablets of High Hrothgar suggest that the dragons ruled over all Mundus before the birth of men. But when exactly the dragons arrived on Tamriel is not known. There is a very obscure theory, one I've talked about before and may cover again, that Isgramor and the 500 companions were in fact dragons. But that's a topic for another time. Simply put, the Nords and the dragons coexisted in the late Malefic, early First Era, and the power imbalance between the two races was stark. Bjork goes on to say, grand temples were built to honour the dragons and appease them. Dragons, being dragons, embrace their role as god-kings over men. After all, were they not fashioned in Akatosh's own image? Were they not superior in every way to the hordes of small, soft creatures that worshipped them? For dragons, power equals truth. They had the power, so therefore it must be truth. Dragons granted small amounts of power to the dragon priests in exchange for absolute obedience. In turn, the dragon priests ruled men as equals to the kings. Dragons, of course, could not be bothered with actually ruling. Alduin had the power of his divine father, on top of the biological advantage of being a legendary immortal worm. Naturally, the prospect of destroying the world that he could easily subjugate instead was going to take a lot of restraint. Alduin possessed the ability to destroy everything his shadow touched, but he also possessed arrogance of a caliber only possible for a dragon. It is a time-old concept, duty versus desire. It is also a time-old concept that from the tinder of tyranny sparks the blaze of revolution. Bjork writes, the dragon priests began to rule with an iron fist, making virtual slaves of the rest of the population. When the populace rebelled, the dragon priests retaliated. When the dragon priests could not collect the tribute or control the masses, the dragon's response was swift and brutal. So it was that the Dragon War began. Men died in droves, but then the gods entered the fray. As it was in the dawn, the advance of the dragons, led by Alduin, was met by the armies of men, led by Shor. Of course, Shor was dead, right? No, remember the monomyth. But when Trinimac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, this heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other. Shor was weak, but so long as his realm persisted, so would he. And Shor had great allies, like his cherished widow Kine. The warrior wife and goddess of storms wept when Auriel and his champion slew her husband, but in the Dragon War she would avenge him. The etched tablets tell of Kine's intervention. The dragons presided over the crawling masses. Men were weak then and had no voice. The fledgling spirits of men were strong in old times, unafraid to war with dragons and their voices. But the dragons only shouted them down and broke their hearts. Kine called on Parthenax, who pitied man. Together they taught men to use the voice. Then the Dragon War raged, dragon against tongue. Parthenax, Alduin's second in command, defected to the side of men, taking orders from Kine instead of the World Eater, and the tides of battle turned in favour of men. Kine carried out the will of her dead husband, but there was no victor in the war with the dragons, for the Nords resorted to the power of Kel, the Elder Scroll, to cast Alduin adrift on the currents of time. As with almost all major events on Tamriel, Lorkhan got his way from beyond the grave. By sending the World Eater forward in time, his realm was able to live on. And this is where we hit the fundamental question: did Alduin really abandon his purpose? Should world eating be taken literally? The further back in the Tamrielic timeline you go, the more myth merges with reality, and the more common supernatural events become. But I believe Alduin was on track to destroy the world before the Nords called upon the prophetic power of the Elder Scrolls. In Yakudan mythology, Satakal the World Snake is plagued by eternal hunger. He is depicted as the Ouroboros, eating his own tail. If the realm both begins and ends in the dawn, then time is circular, feeding into itself. The head and the tail are one and the same. Satakal is a metaphor. I believe the World Eater title is the same. Alduin is a formidable force, but he is not going to literally consume the soil. How then does Alduin bring about the end of the world? I mentioned earlier the notion that the mortal realm returns to a dawn state at the beginning and the end of the era. Just as Auriel and his elves warred with Lorkhan and his humans at the advent of the world, so too will they war at the world's end. Auriel wished to be free from the trickster's trap, and the elves wished to return to Etherius. Similarly, Alduin and the dragons were supposed to destroy Tamriel. Alduin seemingly neglected his duty and instead chose tyranny. But what if eating was a metaphor for Alduin's insatiable greed and desire for ultimate power? Earlier I said that the tinder of tyranny sparks the blaze of revolution, and that's exactly what the Dragon War was. We can see a clear parallel between the Dragon War and what happened in the adjacent place of Lig. The dregs were highly intelligent, and they ruled their slave oceans with iron pincers. In the Mythic Dawn commentaries, Mankar Cameron says, they were akin to the time totems of old, yet evil and full of mockery and profane powers. The time totems of old is Mankar comparing the dregs to the dragons. The dregs were so egregious, so merciless, that the seas boiled with insurrection. By the magic word Numantia, a great rebellion rose up and pulled down the towers of Kimel Garjig. And the Templars of the upstart were slaughtered, and blood fell like dew from the upper wards down to the lowest pits, where the slaves with maniacal faces took chains and teeth to their jailers, and all hope was brushfire. The towers toppled, and Lig was liberated from creation. The world was dismantled by the slaves in their retributive rage. But would you not also agree that this destruction was caused by the dregs, by the dragons of Lig? Alduin's avarice is innate to him. He devours through conquest and persecution. And with the onset of the Dragon War, whether he knew it or not, the consumption of the world had begun. But the dead god Shor is ever meddlesome when the fate of his plane is at stake. His widow Kine, through her conduit Parthenax, gifted the Nords with the storm voice. But wait, wouldn't empowering the humans only bring more ruination to his realm? If only Alduin could be removed from the picture without destroying the world. That's where the Elder Scroll comes into play. By casting Alduin adrift on the currents of time, the Dragon War came to a swift end, and the mortal realm began to heal. But this was not a permanent solution. Parthenax says, some hoped he would be gone forever, forever lost. I knew better. Time flows ever onward. One day he would surface. Which is why I've lived here. For thousands of mortal years I've waited. I knew where he would emerge, but not when. Fortunately, the dead god Shor is patient, and he was ready for this eventual return. The World Eater awoke in the 201st year of the Fourth Era to complete his task. However, he would fail again, thanks to the rise of the Last Dragonborn. How very convenient. The Last Dragonborn is often referred to as Ysmir, Dragon of the North, which is a name shared by a few pivotal characters, all of whom are heroes of men, Shezarines. Ysmir Wolfarth, Pelennor Whitestrake, Talos Stormcrown, and the Last Dovahkiin. The Last Dragonborn is an avatar of Shor, and carries out his divine will. So, when Alduin returns, at the peak of civil unrest in Skyrim, when Tamriel as a whole is weak, the World Eater's task should have been simple. But the Last Dragonborn came, and Alduin was slain, at least for now. So, with all of this in mind, I don't think Alduin did anything wrong. I don't believe he abandoned his destiny. I believe it was in fact the Nords who defied fate by calling upon the power of the Elder Scroll and the Shezareen. The mortal realm persevered, and Lorkhan is very pleased with that outcome. And there you have it, guys, why Alduin did nothing wrong. Thank you so much for watching. Drumora is a new channel, and I'm dedicated to seeing it grow so I can continue to tell these stories. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. Please, only pledge if you can afford it. I've also started a Discord, so if you'd like to chat to me and anyone else interested in Elder Scrolls, Elden Ring and The Witcher, come join. Thank you so much again. My name's Drew the Daedrologist. You've been watching Drumora, and I'll see you in the next one.